Hello, everybody. You're listening to the new WCEG Network on WCEG Talk Radio. You can watch us on your smart TV if you have one. You can listen to us on YouTube at WCEG Network. My name is Rev Diane Dougherty, and I am your host for Take a Stand. I, with my partner, Demita Chapman, interview activists and very concerned citizens working to expand democracy in our city, in our state, and in our nation. We are the worldwide community empowerment group where we speak truth and life into the community. Take a minute and like us on Facebook, or you can subscribe, and we encourage your network to do the same. Go to YouTube. Follow us on Twitter. We're on Instagram at WCEG_talk_radio and at WCEG Network. Last but not least, this is a disclaimer. The topics and opinions of those on this show, their hosts and the guests, are not WCEG Network. Thank you for your continued support. And let's get started with this amazing conversation we're going to have today. Today, I am interviewing Reverend David Lewicki, and we are going to have a conversation that's most needed on critical race theory. I'm sure that you've seen it in the news, you've heard it on TV, you've possibly been to a school board meeting and had some kind of interaction with someone that is raising this as an issue. So I had the great fortune to find a sermon done by Reverend David Lewicki at his church, North Decatur Presbyterian. What I loved about their church is it is a very progressive Christian church, and they lay the issues that are prominent in our society out today so that all members and those affiliates can talk about it. So David, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Diane. It's great to be in conversation with you today. So appreciate the invitation to talk. I'd love to tell you about myself. As you said, I'm currently serving as the co-pastor of North Decatur Presbyterian Church. My partner, Beth Waltemath, and I have been serving there together for 11 years. And it's a wonderful community of faith just on the northern edge of the city of Decatur in unincorporated DeKalb County. So that's where we call home. We're raising our 3 kids here, and that's an adventure in and of itself about how you raise up kids in the world today. But we've lived here for 11 years. We met as students at a place called Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, where we both did our master's degrees, and where that's actually where I got exposed to critical race theory in the first place as part of my studies there. So we're both Presbyterian pastors, and we thought, as we were sort of planning out worship this fall, racism has been on the sort of the front of so many folks' minds in this last sort of season of our collective life, and specifically critical race theory has been talked about so much in the news over the last year or so. We thought it was a good time to talk with our congregation, like, what is this thing, and how can we understand it from where we are today? So,
I thought it was interesting how you brought it up, that it was really part of a long-term conversation where you had many conversations about it in various parts. Could you let us know a little bit about how you organized that conversation before we start on the big picture?
Sure. Our congregation is part of a denomination called the Presbyterian Church USA, and the PCUSA has an initiative called the Matthew 25 initiative. And Matthew 25, for those of you who have picked up your Bibles lately, talks about is that passage where Jesus says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. And it encourages congregations to take up a few specific practices as part of our life together. We're supposed to address systemic poverty and also address systemic racism as part of our congregation's life and ministry as a Matthew 25 church. So for us, being a Matthew 25 congregation requires that we talk regularly about racism as an organizing principle in our life and as a subject of theological concern. So that's the framework in which it didn't come out of the blue for our congregation to be talking about race, to be talking about racism in a Sunday worship service.
I don't know very many churches that talk about racism within the Sunday service. I know
that's because it's hard, Diane. That's because it's complicated and deep, and we all come from so many different places. But I get what you're saying. It is hard. It is hard.
I think one of the hard things is that we don't have any ability down here in the South. I've been here for over 30 years now, and there's no ability in the South to really have an organizing principle that talks about it within a theological framework. I know you come from Union Theological, and as a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, Reverend Brenda Smith, went to Union. And
yes,
I didn't know we were all connected. I know she was here the other day.
Beautiful.
I know.
Beautiful.
Because she's been talking about Union forever and ever. And I thought, it occurred to me that the conversations that she raises has never been part of any church or theological organization I belonged to. And so from my perspective, as a white woman, religious pastor, I don't have that rootedness in both conversation and access to information. But I picked a lot up because of all of my beautiful African-American friends. And when I became a priest, for those that don't know, I'm a Roman Catholic priest, excommunicated because I'm a woman, which is all right, because we change by moving. I decided that my congregation would be diverse. And that's how I got onto this wonderful station, WCEG. I find it to be a community of livelihood and information. And it is an empowering group. So let's begin with CRT then. Let me tell all of the listeners about my own experience of CRT when I was asked to go to a conference in Forsyth County. I had heard of CRT. I knew what it was, critical race theory. I think I had one media presentation, just maybe about 2 minutes about it. So when I got there, I was kind of shocked to find out that the fear mongering that is going through the waves in our homes, on our streets, in our cities, in our state and nation is all centered around false information about what CRT is and the fear that parents have for their children within our school system. So that was my introduction. And after I read your sermon, which is we will put it on the website for those who would like to see, helped me to come to terms with context and content. So there you go. If you would start speaking, we will all listen.
Yeah. Well, I think, Diane, I want to just allude to your sort of your previous comment, just to sort of say you were talking about a little bit about how how it is that we get formed to be able to talk about things like race and racism and CRT. I mean, a lot of us as white folks are not part of communities where that's part of conversation. So, like when we're invited into conversation, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know how to do this because I don't have any practice in how to talk. Like, what terms do I use? How do I think about this? And it can be really overwhelming for a lot of folks to sort of step into some of these conversations for the first time. And I hope our conversation today helps to, demystify some things and maybe give some handleholds for people to engage in this conversation in your own communities. I was fortunate to be at Union, which is a place where conversation about race and racism and the intersection with theology is just part of the water, right? It's just, I mean, that's natural there. And so I spent 3 years in the master's program really learning how to think about myself as a person with a racial identity, how to think about things like white supremacy, how to think about justice, racial justice, and how to talk about that from a theological lens. So what a gift it was to me to be at a place like Union. And I realized, I mean, that a lot of folks in our congregation and my congregation, they just have never been in spaces like that. So we are trying to create in our church, a place where we can get a little bit more familiar because it's important, it's really important that we learn how to talk about race. I got curious about, my ears perked up when CRT got in the news. And that, as I looked through it, it was sometime last fall. And the truth is, Diane, there is a conservative activist who I think was employed by the Heritage Foundation or one of the conservative foundations, who pretty much decided to make CRT an issue. And he borrowed this term, CRT, critical race theory, and he began to use it very aggressively in media outlets. And so CRT right now, the way it functions right now in our culture, critical race theory really almost refers to anything related to race and racial consciousness. So CRT, people talk about CRT in reference to the Black Lives Matter movement. People talk about CRT in reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at corporations in the business world or at schools. People talk about CRT being responsible for removing statues of Robert E. Lee and Christopher Columbus, in public plazas around the country. So CRT has become a kind of a punching bag, a language for a punching bag for mostly conservative folks to say we don't want conversation about race and racism and the history, the profound history of racial discrimination and injustice to be part of our life, our worldview right now. So I think one of the things that we can do today, Diane, is to tease apart what actual CRT is, which is actually a really wonderful and helpful theory that comes out of legal studies, and kind of what's posing as CRT in the public conversation right now.
Good.
So maybe I'll do that for a second. I mean, I think let me talk about what CRT actually is. Can I use the slides that I've got? Would that be great? Let me show that. Let me show these to you now, and we can kind of talk through these because it gives a very basic sense of what we're discussing here. So let's do this. So critical race theory is a tool for dismantling systemic racism. That's how I understand it. It's a way of thinking about the world, and it's designed to help people who are interested in dismantling systemic racism. Critical race theory is not, let's be clear about the couple things that it's not first. It's not being taught to grade school kids, right? So critical race theory is a legal theory, right? It comes out of law school. You're most likely to encounter it in a master's program or in a PhD program somewhere, maybe as an undergraduate somewhere. So your kids are not learning critical race theory, whatever is talked about at the school board meeting. And like I said, when they're talking about critical race theory at school board meetings, they're talking about things like teaching history that focuses on the experience of Black Americans, and specifically the history of discrimination and injustice against Black Americans. So it's not being taught to grade school kids, critical race theory. Critical race theory is also not a theory that says that all white people are bad or that all white people are racist. You'll hear that said a lot, that critical race theory is itself racism. That's one of the primary objections that you'll hear in the media. They'll say, oh, well, this is like reverse racism, because it's saying that all white people are bad. And in fact, critical race theory does not say anything of the sort. Critical race theory is also, I think, it's important to say, it's not something about which anyone needs to be scared, right? It's not meant to inflict harm on anyone, to persecute anyone. It is a way of thinking about the world. It's a theory. It's a tool to help us understand a specific dimension of our world, which is how race functions, has functioned and does function as an organizing idea in our society. So what is critical race theory? It is a way of thinking about how race functions as an organizing principle in our lives. That's what CRT is. It is also a legal theory, which I said primarily taught in law schools, that kind of emerged in the 70s and 80s as a way to explain why, in spite of all of the accomplishments that had happened in the civil rights movement, all of the legal victories that had happened in the civil rights movement, why hadn't outcomes for Black Americans, why weren't they changing? And so, so a lot of these scholars were sort of saying, wait a minute, like, haven't we achieved justice? And they were saying, well, no, like, it really hasn't the legal victories haven't fundamentally changed the reality for a lot of Black Americans. And so we need to bring this particular racial lens to thinking about the law and what the law does do and what the law can't do. And I think a critical race theory is a tool for people in all types of institutions, including churches, right? I mean, that's why I brought it up in our congregation. I think it's a tool for people in all kinds of institutions to use to talk about disparate and unequal racial outcomes. And then last but not least, I'll say these things. What does critical race theory do? Like, why do I think it's a useful tool? Number one, I think it affirms the uniqueness and the importance of Black thought, Black perspectives, and Black experiences. Sometimes I will say to people, if you want a handle on what people are talking about with CRT, just substitute the phrase "the lived experience of Black Americans." And I think you'll find that, like, one of the things that white folks are objecting to right now is they actually don't want to deal with the real experience of Black Americans, right? The lived experience of Black Americans. That's actually what they're rejecting. They're calling it critical race theory, but what they're actually responding to, they're pushing back against is the real experience of our friends and our neighbors who are Black. Critical race theory also refuses to affirm the validity of color blindness. You've got a lot of folks right now who will say, oh, well, that's why they're calling critical race theory reverse racism. They're saying, well, it privileges the Black experience over the white experience. And, we can talk a little bit more about that. But I would say that rather than privileging the Black experience over the white experience, they're saying we should not be too quick to reduce the Black experience to a homogeneous, universalized experience, right? That we ought to just keep space for Black folks to articulate their own experience and to let it just stand on its own, right? And that we shouldn't always sort of look for things like color blindness, like that, like, I just want to be race neutral. CRT would say, actually, because of the history of America, a lot of us we can't really be race neutral. We have to be able to continue to look at things through a racialized lens. And then the last thing that CRT does is that it insists that there continues to be a gap between America's ideals about us as a land of the free and the home of the brave, and ideals about who we are as a place that values justice and righteousness, And there's a gap between those ideals and the actual experience of Black Americans. And CRT says that gap is a place of moral urgency, right? That we just can't sort of pretend like that gap doesn't exist, that we can brush it off. We have to pay attention to that gap, and CRT kind of asks us to do that.
Well done. In light of what you have just shown us, and in terms of the gap, I think one of the things I've come to realize living in Avondale Estates is the complete bubble that I live in or could live in if I didn't go outside myself and or outside this city, because people who have lived here forever don't see, we're very isolated. Our churches are white, our schools are white, our communities are white. And I started to ask the question, why? And after I left the convent in 1987, I came to the realization that in these communities where, quote unquote, I teach, as a Roman Catholic, I could never afford to live there because the salary that I received, or that especially the sisters received, was so low, you could never buy a house. I always had to live outside of that city, the cities that I worked in. And I think that because of that, we've developed this myopic vision that there isn't economic disparity.
Yeah.
And unless you have little kids in your family, or I should say young adults that are bringing home a salary that is so low they cannot own a home, buy a car, they have to live with you.
Diane, you've put your finger on, I think, what is, by talking about where you live and sort of what the dynamics there are like, you've put your finger on the place where CRT, I think, where it becomes so useful for us. And I have a journey that is very similar to yours. I mean, a lot of the way I come at this as a white person is asking that dangerous question, which you asked, which is why? Like, why does my community look like this? So I grew up in a very white suburb of Columbus, Ohio. And, when I grew up there, nobody really, like there was an awareness in the 80s and early 90s that like, okay, well, there aren't very many Black folks here. But the explanation, Diane, was that, people just want to live with people who are like them. Right. I mean, we just gravitate as human beings to people who are like us. Right. That was the sort of the unofficial reason. It wasn't that I was in college and I was assigned to write a paper for a class about the place where I came from. And so I went back to the library in my hometown on a school break and I was digging around in the archives. Well, Diana, it turns out that when that community was formed in the first decades of the 1900s, there were racial covenants written into the deeds of the houses in that community. So legally in that community, if you were Black, you could not own a home. So, Diane, it wasn't that Black folks didn't want to live there. They legally could not buy a home in that community, right? So, you get 60, 70 years down the road and people don't remember that. They think that, oh, well, it's just people live where they want to live. And that's not right. Like the reason that Black folks didn't live in that community was legal racial discrimination, right? It was legal at that time to have those racial covenants. The other thing that community did over the years is they controlled zoning, right? So that there would be no apartment buildings that could be built in the community. They wanted to limit the number of apartment buildings that were built in that community. Why do you think they did that, Diane?
Is that Arlington?
Yeah, you got it. You're reading
My family lived there.
You've been reading my mail. Dan, they limited the city council controlled the zoning because they didn't want poor folk and Black folk living in the community. And that's exactly what CRT talks about. All of that stuff was legal. It was all just. I mean, the law was working as it was intended, but there were motivations beneath the level of what was legal that were fomenting and perpetuating racial discrimination. And when you open your eyes to sort of the way that racism is inscribed in all across our communities, all across the United States, you can't unsee it, right? You can't unsee it.
Exactly.
And so CRT as a legal theory emerged to sort of say, we have to see it. We do see it. We have to see it. We have to name it so that we don't keep unconsciously replicating those kinds of racial discrimination, those kind of patterns of racial discrimination in the future.
And what's so interesting is they're doing the maps. I'm part of the Fair Districts, Georgia.
Yeah.
And they've unveiled many maps so far, and they're doing the same thing. It's a form of gerrymandering so that various Democratic or party affiliates do not have equal votes.
Right.
So that they can maintain power. So it's a form of power structuring.
Right. There's a wonderful book that's called The Color of Law. And it talks about.
Oh, I have that.
Yeah, it's just I commend it to everyone. It's a tremendous book that talks about how principally how redlining, that phenomena that worked to not only sort of kind of keep white folks and Black folks physically separate, but also served to enrich white people and to impoverish Black people. And right, so mapping. I mean, the way that lines are drawn, the way that districts are drawn, it continues to be a legal, a fully legal way of continuing to keep us racially isolated from one another. So again, CRT is simply saying something can be legal and still be racist, right? And so that's what it's asking us to pay attention to.
And the assumption is that white people will go along with it.
Yeah.
Which is not true. That's not true.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe we can talk a little bit, Diane, about some of the resistance to CRT and what might be sort of behind it. I do think that there's this, that as you sort of say, there are a lot more white folks right now, like myself, like yourself, who are really becoming awake and alert. We've had the veil lifted from our eyes. We're willing to see and to name the way that race and racism has been inscribed on landscapes and bodies, and we want to be different going forward. But as we're seeing, by the obsession that Fox News has with CRT, there are just a lot, and the school board, all these school board meetings and the laws that are going to pop up here in the state of Georgia when the legislative session starts again. There are a lot of people that simply are not wanting to face in any way the reality of the history of oppression and injustice. So there's just, I mean, we're experiencing yet again such a common phenomenon in America, which is white backlash to the articulation of the experience of pain and discrimination by our Black neighbors.
Oh, one of the interesting at that talk. I went to one of the books that was raised first was The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Ferrari, as a
Sure.
book that should be taken off the shelves of all libraries.
Well, that's because it's dangerous, right? I mean, it is a dangerous book for sure.
You know, we're living in a democracy. That shouldn't be dangerous. What's dangerous is are those that keep us from living in a democracy, and those that maintain that Christianity is a cudgel
Yeah.
that uh, that will not protect democracy. That there's something evil within it, and I think just the opposite. I think Christianity has never been lived because so many are tied up to these false notions that God is a warrior that is going to bash the enemy, and the enemy is, well, for now, Democrats.
Mm. Well, I love that you invited a conversation about how Christianity fits into all this, because that's, I mean, obviously that's something that is important to me. And when I say Paulo Freire is dangerous, I mean a good kind of dangerous, right? He dangerous in the way that Jesus is dangerous. If you actually read and pay attention to what he said, Jesus talks about blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful, blessed are you when you are persecuted. Jesus is, the last will be first. There is a way in the Gospels that that Jesus articulates a worldview that fundamentally privileges and prioritizes those who are suffering above those who are not suffering, right? So Jesus invites us to look at the world in that way. In fact, I think not just invites us, but requires us to look at the world in that way. And I think when you are sitting in the American context, as we all are, we are doing ourselves a profound disservice if we refuse to acknowledge that in America, if you have Black skin, you have been given a raw deal, and that you have suffered incredibly and unjustly. So, I think the lens of Christianity, the way it invites us to see and be in the world, makes us ask these questions, right? This CRT, I think, has deep harmonies with the gospel of Jesus, right? Because it's
Absolutely.
asking us to say, who around you is suffering? Who has suffered? And how might you see the world through the lens of those who suffer? The sermon that I preached was about that text in Matthew 25. Jesus says, when you have cared for those among you who are suffering, you have cared for me. Jesus takes the ontological place, that big word. Jesus sort of assumes the being of those who are suffering and says, that is who I am. And as you are to those who are suffering around you, you are to me. And I can't, as a white American, not see that there might be instances in the way I walk through this world where my whiteness puts me on top, and where someone's dark skin puts them in a place where they have suffered unjustly. So that's why I really have invited my congregation to sort of say, yeah, CRT is not something to be afraid of. In fact, it has these wonderful harmonies and resonances with the kind of worldview that Jesus is always inviting us to take.
I love it. I love it. I think one of the things I've learned is that, or I'm doing on my own, as a white woman who has been relatively silent, which is complicit, But there's a place of limbo, because once you learn about this, you have to have time to process it. So I'm lamenting. I'm in the process of lament. And I go to Montgomery on my own, and I make a little retreat. And I walk through all of those, I call them iron tombstones.
Yep.
And I keep saying to them, I know you're not coming back. I know you're not coming back. All I can do is weep at the depth of my soul for the thousands of dead bodies that my white brothers and sisters were complicit in when they were silent. And that as I sit there, I feel like I'm Job. I trust that God is with me in that lament. That from the from that capstone of sorrow, that's where I think God is. I really do. And that when we show up to lament, I think God comes with us. So this season,
that's beautiful.
For Advent and for Lent, I'm lamenting.
Diane, I love that you shared that, and it totally resonates with my spirit. That holy place in Montgomery is just it is such an essential part of our life now, for everyone to take a pilgrimage to. I mean, we have, as a culture, as a nation, refused to remember the pain and the trauma. And it's just like, you can't live that way. We can't live that way. We have to be able to remember and remember rightly, and to feel, as you're sort of saying. I love the image that you sort of share about feeling it in your body, and feeling the grief and feeling the trauma. I mean, I have a similar experience. I went there a couple summers ago and wept. And I think all of us need to do that in some way, because because this trauma is not just part of Black bodies, but it's part of white bodies too. And if we have this theological sense that we are all made in the image of a common creator, which is part of my tradition, right? We say that God makes us and that we all bear God's image. If that is true as a fundamental truth of our existence, then when that image in one another gets defaced or degraded, and that's never acknowledged and never named and never apologized for, and never made amends for, it is a profound source of grief and loss and hurt for Black people specifically, but also, I would say, for white people. And so that, what Brian Stevenson has done and is doing, to even begin to move us culturally, spiritually, politically on a path of restoration and reconciliation, to acknowledge the scale of the grief and the loss in a public, embodied way. It's so moving and so important. And in this conversation, I would say, Diane, we very quickly, these conversations about CRT get, they get to be in our heads, and we get all emotional in it. And really what we're talking about is a history of pain and a history of grief that has been inflicted upon real human beings, that was totally unmerited and unwarranted. And so kind of revisiting, kind of being able to sit with that grief and sort of say, what we're really talking about here is these horrible things that were done that are part of our past. They are true. And we have to be able to name them, talk about them, talk about the ways that that the legacy of that hurt continues to inhabit our social, theological spaces. Boy, that's the heart of it right there. You got it. You got it.
We have a question here that says, I understand CRT is taught in law school. However, shouldn't we introduce this theory while we are young to help cultivate young minds? Because if we wait until adulthood, our minds are already deeply rooted in supremacy.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I would reframe the question. Like, I would not advocate teaching CRT at grade school, but I would advocate teaching about race and talking about the racial history of America, talking about white supremacy. White supremacy is not, Diane, it's not a debated reality, right? It's so clearly inscribed in American life. And you can argue about, how it shows up and where it shows up and who's responsible for it, but it is an unavoidable historical fact. So we ought to be able to name that with our kids. We ought to be able to teach about it from a very early age in school so that we have a concept of what formed us, what formed the place where we inhabit now, so that we can act with moral agency in the present. So for sure, I love that, the debate about CRT right now is really a debate about the extent to which we ought to name white supremacy as something that was a force in American life and continues to operate as such. I mean, it's a vital debate. I mean, there's no right or wrong, answer in terms of how you do it, where you do it, when you do it. But for sure, we ought to be talking about it. Yeah.
Well, a very interesting. I think I told you this, that when I was in the second grade, the social studies curriculum in second grade is very clear about discrimination. They teach Native Americans, the rivers of Georgia. We have 3 months where we celebrate African Americans, Latinos, women. So this one year, and I'm a big activist that likes to do theater. So I had
Awesome.
the kids line the chairs up in bus form, and one guy got to be the bus driver. He was so happy. And then the others were getting on the bus. And I said, now, if you have blue eyes, you have to get in the back of the bus. You can't get on first. And you have to sit in the back. And so they associated themselves according to their eyes. The brown-eyed kids got on the bus. The blue-eyed kids just stood there. And one guy cried.
Right.
One guy cried.
Yeah.
He said, I don't want to sit in the back of the bus. I want to sit with my friends. So they all got off the bus and said, we'll be with you.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful.
We all get off the bus. We don't want you to cry.
Wow. There's so much evidence that suggests that young children begin to understand and have an awareness of race from a very early age. And, and my own experience growing up in a mostly white neighborhood confirms that. I mean, from a very young age, I could tell that there were neighborhoods where white people lived and they were different from neighborhoods where Black people lived.
That's right.
Right? Like, you see that. And so, the explanations that we give to kids about why that is are so important. That there is this history that is in which people treated other people horribly, and that history goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and we need to think about how not to continue it, right? I mean, I think kids get it. Like, they can be part of that conversation. You don't have to indoctrinate them in some, in CRT or whatever. Like, they want to have those conversations. They want to be invited into them. We can't, the whole conversation about banning certain things. I mean, the quickest way to make a kid curious about something is to ban it. So, they're gonna figure it out at some point. They're gonna do their own work. They're gonna, like I did when I was a freshman in college and went to write the paper.
right.
Like, you're gonna figure out the truth eventually. So we ought to talk to kids from a very early age, give them the ability to think, to talk. As we started our conversation, talking about race is hard. And so, we get it wrong. We make mistakes. We speak and we act out of unconscious bias. But we shouldn't prevent kids from learning and from talking. We ought to encourage it and nurture it for sure.
One of the issues that I faced when I was teaching in Marietta, this is really a very revealing, that was almost 20 years ago. But we had a little Black girl that was put into the Catholic school, and her grandfather and she lived around the corner. So she walked to school every day, and Grandpa came, and he had to pay out of religion. He had to pay a surcharge because they were not Catholic. And every month he came with this wad of cash, $250 a month, which at that time was just an exorbitant amount, as long as I was. And I was her teacher, and she lived right around the corner. So she walked home. Well, he came and picked her up, but they walked to school. Not one child in that neighborhood came to that school, that Catholic school. They were all car riders. Huh. And, that was kind of foreign to me, because we had busing. And I said to the sister, I said, well, how come the people in this area don't come to the school, but Nikki does, and everybody else is a car rider, and they travel long ways to get to the school? And she said, that goes all the way back to segregation, that the city lines were redrawn and it became a Black district. They didn't have money, nor did the parish itself want the school to become, quote unquote, an enclave for Black non-Catholics. Wow. So they upped the tuition to make it more attractive to people in the suburbs. They upped the tuition.
Wow.
And all those conversations were never had. That was just matter of fact. And it's, every life goes on as usual. But the church was white.
Yep.
The church was all white, and people traveled to come.
Yeah. The legacy of racism, both the personal kind of racism that we think about in terms of people being racist, but also the structural racism that we've been alluding to is all over Atlanta. I mean, the entire sort of geography of Atlanta is inscribed with these sort of with racially coded features, right? So the entire northern suburbs of Atlanta are places where white people fled to when desegregation happened.
Yeah, Cobb County. When I moved to Cobb County, they wouldn't have buses come out there because they didn't want Blacks.
Right. That's the whole story about MARTA too, right? Why does MARTA only go so far? Because because the white communities didn't want the Black people coming into those communities. There anyway. And so now the wonderful kind of crazy thing is that the northern Atlanta suburbs are some of the most diverse places in all of Georgia. Not just with Black folks, but with immigrants and other people of color. So, but yeah, I mean, the whole sort of story about Christian schools in the northern Atlanta suburbs, these Christian academies that were created as private schools that they could be white only, and they didn't have to worry about segregation. It's all, if you don't have to look very far in Atlanta to see.
I think one of the issues
how it works.
Critical race theory lays in front of us is exhaustion. The more you know, the more exhausted you get, because from someone like my perspective, what power do you have? You're powerless over that system. So when we're talking about systemic racism, we're also talking about systemic white power that keeps all of this in place. Um, I think I was talking to you about Bettina Love's book. It's called We Want to Do More Than Survive, an abolitionist teaching and the pursuit of educational freedom. Because it is so intertwined in all of these systems. Do we just cut the systems apart, or do we work to change the system and then it returns to its former self? Can you give some insight into what your thoughts are on just the
magnitude of it all? Yeah, one of the things that I said in my sermon, which I would share with you and with the folks who are listening, is that the truth of learning the truth as a white person feels lousy. It is not a good feeling to learn about the way that race has functioned in America, and so. But I say that, and just to acknowledge it, that what you've sort of said, and which I think a lot of folks who have learned about racism and how it functions, they say, gosh, this really feels bad. And I want to say, yeah, it does feel bad. That is not an excuse to deny it, to pretend like it's not important, or it didn't exist, or it didn't happen the way you said. Like you gotta be a little bit willing to sit with that difficulty. One way of framing that is to say, well, it's not any harder than it has been for Black Americans to struggle under the weight of oppression for 400 years, right? So yeah, that you think it's hard for you as a white person. Well, put yourself in a different set of shoes, and let's talk about what's hard. So that's one response to that. Another response is to say, I had a teacher at Union Seminary whose name is Jim Cone. He's recently departed, gone to be with the saints. And he was the pioneer of something called Black theology, which is really looking at Christian theology through the lens of the Black experience. And so Jim was this he was hated by a lot of white theologians who felt like he was just distorting the gospel, but also beloved by his students. And he would always say, he had this very high-pitched voice, and he would always say to his students, he'd say to his white students, he'd say, you don't have to despair as a white student. He said, you can still become Black. And and what he meant by that, I always remember him saying that, is he meant to sort of say, we have the capacity for empathy. And for that is part of our humanness. Like we can put ourselves in the shoes of our neighbors in such a way that we can actually experience what they are experiencing, not in exactly the same way, but in a kind of a mirroring kind of way. And so he would sort of say to us, and this is how I heard it, I would always sort of hear him sort of say, you as a white person can lean in enough to the experience of your Black neighbors and your Black colleagues, and to other Black Americans. With your empathy, you can lean in enough so that you can feel what this feels like to us. And that is a kind of solidarity. I think it leads you to to reevaluate your life and your priorities. Certainly it invites you to become aware of how you wear your whiteness on a day-to-day, how you operate in the world as a white person, where that opens doors for you, that doors might close for other people. It just changes who you are, Diane. I mean, it just, and in a good way, right? It's in that way that, as a Christian, I think Jesus invites us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, right? That sense of oneness and solidarity. So it is hard. it feels lousy as a white person to really hold the weight of what has been done and continues to be done by racism. But it's not a hopelessness. It doesn't have to devolve into a sense of despair. It can be very humanizing and I think very powerful. So that's what I say to my congregation. It's been my own experience. Sometimes it's hard, but this is the right way, right? This is the narrow path.
And another thing is these issues, systemic issues, have been with humanity since the Neolithic period. They're not going away.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah.
But what is going away for me is the power they had over me. The more that I allow grief as an empathetic response to remain with me, the more powerful I think I get. Because that through grief, I become one with the other.
I love that. I love that. I think that's incredibly well put to, and we've said it a couple times in our conversation. There continue to be opportunities for white people to feel, and it is really about, there's a feeling dimension. It's a non-rational sort of dimension to this, but to feel the hurt, to feel the pain, to feel the grief, that is also part of what this I think journey of healing, journey of justice requires.
One of the mothers that was at this meeting was talking about teachers who were making their kids feel guilty because they're white. I don't know what kind of teaching is going on, but I think one of the things that I get from this conversation, and that we all can share in, and we'll have to close soon, is that we have a responsibility not to lay guilt on anyone. I mean, it could go the other way. Black people can make white people feel guilty if you wanted that. But to say, this is our mutual experience of our ancestors, and we are going to be the ancestors that are remembered for stopping it. Wow. Wouldn't that be good?
That's powerful. I love that. You drop this guilt at the end of our conversation. It's such a big topic, but I also would say I come out of a tradition in which guilt can be forgiven. In which
not in the Catholic Church.
God, I believe it. We
go to confession, but we keep our guilt.
I believe in a merciful God, and so that guilt, guilt, at least in some way, it's the acknowledgement of moral obligation. If you're guilty about something, you say, "Oh, yeah, I feel connected to you. I feel badly that this happened. I feel implicated." It affirms that we have a moral relationship with each other, right? It. And I also believe that, in this tradition, guilt, we can be forgiven and we can be free to love. That's what God wants for us, that we be free to love each other fully. So guilt can be a pathway on that journey to freedom. But we can feel it, but we can be released from it too.
What a powerful person you are, and how excited I am to have found that you are doing the preaching to a wonderful congregation that has ears to hear. And on that note, I would like our listeners to re-listen to this wonderful conversation about critical race theory, and also to think about, especially if you're white, practicing lament within the context of empathy, joining hearts with those of the past, not to feel guilty, but also to feel that there is something that we can do in our age to shift the tone, to shift the purpose, to shift the age. So thank you so much, David. You're wonderful.
Diane, you do a great job preaching to your congregation too. You have a great program. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. And you've been listening to WCEG, Take a Stand. And with that, we're signing off. This was Reverend David Lewicki, and I am Reverend Diane Dougherty, your host. We'll see you in 2 weeks. God bless you all. Happy Thanksgiving.